The context of my research, as Elno just said, is that I've just published a book looking at British responses to disease during the 7 Years' War, and I'm in the midst of a project that will provide a comparative overview of French and British medicine and manpower, very much looking at structures of knowledge in the colonies and during wartime during the mid-18th century. So in some ways I'm relatively new to French history, and I'm looking forward to questions and comments from those who are more expert than myself. For my talk today, what I want to do is examine French and British translations of medical writings during the mid-18th century and really focusing on colonial medicine that stemmed from the Franco-British wars of this period. So covering really the War of Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War, and the American War, so from the 1730s or 40s up to the 1780s. And I want to examine how military medical men not only translated each other's medical insights, but also used each other's work in order to stimulate further research. Now, historians usually emphasize cross-channel differences in this context, so they contrast royal and centralized French structures of knowledge with the non-state and informal nature of British science. And here, by contrast, I want to emphasize how medicine in the French armed forces and in the British armed forces was actually strikingly similar. Moreover, medical theories relating to the experience of war and colonial expansion were exchanged, discussed, and shared across national boundaries. So rather than considering war as a problem that disrupted a pan-European republic of letters or as an obstacle to Enlightenment knowledge, here I'd like to suggest that warfare was an integral part of and even a forge of Enlightenment networks of knowledge, as the wars actually stimulated cross-channel intellectual and scientific exchange. So Franco-British medicine during the 18th century wars, I think, shows how Enlightenment cosmopolitanism coexisted with military patriotism and national rivalry. So for my talk, I'm going to begin briefly with a context of military medicine in this period before providing an overview of the translations. And then I want to conclude with some remarks about the implications of this for the development of European medicine, but also broader notions of European identity and difference during this period. So military medicine. So for contemporaries, as for historians, mid-18th century Franco-British wars were notable because of their scope. For the two belligerents that fought each other continuously throughout these wars and across all theaters, Britain and France, an increasing number of European soldiers and sailors were sent to campaign overseas. So fighting in the Caribbean islands, along the west coast of Africa, in India, throughout the colonies in America, as well as in Europe, mid-18th century war sent thousands of men abroad to locations such as India, where previously only a few hundred had gone. As a result, the mid-18th century provided Britain and France with a novel experience of colonial warfare. Now, these wars soon demonstrated to imperial and military administrators the significance of disease. Disease always killed and demobilized far more men than did combat. It was not until the 20th century that battle killed proportionally more men than did disease. Yet overseas campaigns exacerbated such trends. So rates of sickness in the West Indies, in Africa, and in India were not only much higher and much more spectacular than in Europe. So the aptly named Black Vomit, which occurred throughout the Caribbean islands, seemed to affect only newly arrived European soldiers, for example. So not only the types of disease were spectacular, but of course, recruiting more troops to replace sickly soldiers and sailors was more expensive and more difficult in overseas territories. And this was a fact long recognized by military leaders. So as a French military officer, the Marquis de Bussy, recorded in India, it was the climate, particularly the unhealthy season, which was the biggest enemy that we have to fight. So rates of disease were a physical demonstration of logistical and disciplinary weaknesses, and were not only a common cause of military failure and surrender, but also had long-term repercussions, such as encouraging troop desertion on campaign. In colonial environments where officials depended on local cooperation for recruitment, where logistical capabilities were strained, and where new environments gave rise to foreign illnesses, disease was a formidable challenge for military and imperial and medical officials. Keeping European troops in health was thus a crucial part of military strategy and logistics throughout 18th century war, as well as a vital national concern that engaged both military and civilian authorities. Now, both Britain and France maintained extensive medical systems as part of their respective armed forces. Each had surgeons attached to land regiments and naval vessels, along with permanent onshore establishments in the form of hospitals. France's network of military medicine during the mid-18th century was extensive, building on a sophisticated state bureaucracy of both the armed forces and the civilian medicine. And this medical bureaucracy was sustained, if not extended, in French colonial structures, particularly as the responsibilities for the Navy and the colonies were combined in one state department under the Ministère de la Marine et Colonie. And indeed, historians of 18th century French military medicine liken the French overseas medicine to a colonial machine. So this is actually the title of François Régould's and James McClellan's 700-page book that details science and its crucial role in French imperial expansion during the 18th century. It's called The Colonial Machine, so it's seen as the epitome of organized science and with various state structures kind of underpinning it. So the Académie Royale des Sciences, the Royal Navy, the Jardin du Roi, all of these being kind of under the basis of this colonial project. In contrast to France, British military and naval medical establishments during this period have been characterized as more ad hoc, only gradually developing into permanent institutions in the later 18th century, reflecting a British civilian medical establishment that relied upon a variety of non-state hospitals and rather fluid and wide-ranging scientific societies. Yet at the same time, medical service in the British Army and Navy was a popular career route for ambitious and educated, even if poor and unconnected men. And various military medical practitioners could still be well respected. So the military physician Sir John Pringle, for example, was president of the British Royal Society from 1772 to 78. Now in this period, of course, medicine was integral to areas beyond colonial and military development. Indeed, medicine was considered central to Enlightenment ideas of progress, a practical method of achieving widespread social improvement. So for example, 18th century medical theories became increasingly interested in medicine for common people. And we see this in the growth of self-help medical texts and a focus on environmental causes of disease, such as air and climate, rather than personal individual characteristics. European medicine in the 18th century was thus notable for its focus on the health of the general population. No longer content with the regulation of medical practice, physicians and surgeons turned their attention to improving the health of the entire population, having faith in their ability to reform systems and institutions, and often linking medicine and health to Enlightenment ideals and political reform. Now, in recent years, historians have demonstrated the central role of military medicine in these developments. So, for example, research by Colin Jones, Mark Harrison, Othmar Kiel, Ulrich Troller, Monique Lucenay, François Régould, James McClellan, they have all traced how naval and military institutions contributed to the development of modern clinical medicine. So with large groups of men under their command, and with foreign environments encouraging experimentation and empirical techniques, 18th century warfare was central to the changing nature of European medical practice. So military hospitals encouraged streamlined case histories of patients and provided the opportunity for so-called trials. And because of their unprecedented geographical scope, the wars between Britain and France in the mid-18th century were particularly instrumental in shaping medicine during this period. So colonialism was a spur to and an opportunity for empirical practices and experimentation more broadly. So with colonial environments giving rise to what Europeans considered new diseases and new drugs, medical practitioners experimented with novel medicines and were forced to rely on their own sense experiences in order to evaluate efficacy rather than relying on traditional textual forms of authority. And at the same time, the global dimension of these wars proved fundamental to the development of colonial medicine with its category of hot or tropical climates, which were contrasted with European temperate climates. And we can see how this comes to be in the 19th and 20th century into its own discipline called tropical medicine or tropical hygiene, la médecine tropicale, with its basis in London, Liverpool, in Marseille, in all of these ports of empire. So medicine in the armed forces was thus both influential and innovative, encouraging developments that reached the general populations of Britain and France in the 18th century and stimulating widespread social reforms. Now, these histories, therefore, are pointing to underlying similarities between British and French medicine. And I want to pause and point this out because at the same time, these histories continue to see French and British medicine as distinctive and nationalistic endeavors. So developments in British medicine that resemble those in French medicine are described as competing runners in a race, not as teammates. So, we have books on British colonial medicine or French colonial medicine or British military medicine or French military medicine, but we don't have books on European military medicine. Moreover, historians often point to the contrasting structure of medicine in each country, highlighting Britain as the model for non-stake and ad hoc scientific research, which is then contrasted with the centralized colonial machine of France, using comparisons between the two to emphasize national differences. Likewise, histories of 18th century Europe as a cosmopolitan republic of letters consider war as a kind of interruption and obstacle, so events that force scholars to retreat into their national rivalries. So as a result, I think in some ways there remains a gulf between military histories of 18th century Europe and intellectual histories of the same period. And this interdisciplinary consensus on Europe clashes with a more integrated view of war and scientific exchange beyond Europe's shores. So for example, much work has been done on knowledge exchange between Europeans and non-Europeans, especially Europeans and Native Americans, even in times of war. But at the same time, there are very few studies that also examine war as opportunities for intra-European knowledge exchange and learning. So I think a detailed examination of military medicine provides the opportunity to see where military and intellectual history merged during this period and how scientific inquiry and the experience of war influenced one another. And the correspondence between French and British military colonial medicine, I think, is clearly demonstrated in the translation and reception of key texts in the mid-18th century. Now, as historians of intellectual culture during the 18th century have long recognized, European men of letters worked within structures that were both national and transcended such national boundaries. So among the learned, a knowledge of French could be assumed with untranslated texts, such as Deson's Lettres sur les principales maladies qui ont régné dans les hôpitaux de l'armée. This was found in private British libraries widely and cited by Donald Munro, who was physician to the British Army. Yet overall, and more so than vice versa, among British medical circles, English texts reached readers in France through their translation into French, following the course of Enlightenment texts in general. Now, the key authors of British military medicine during the mid-18th century were translated into French. So the naval surgeon and physician James Lynn's two key works on scurvy and the health of seamen were published in French in the 1750s, both within 5 years of the text's initial publication into English. Lynn's papers on fever and infection were also translated into French, along with his essay on diseases of Europeans in hot climates. The military physician Donald Munro's account of the diseases which are the most frequent in the British military hospitals in Germany, which was based on his experience of the 7 Years' War, appeared in French as Medecine in 1769. Similarly, John Pringle's Observations on the Diseases of the Army was published in French right at the opening of the 7 Years' War and was followed actually by a second French edition in 1771. Now, although little is known in general about 18th century translators and their motivations, it's notable that the translators of these works were scholars in similar fields. So Bègue de Presse, who translated Munro's work, also translated other English medical texts and published his own writings on the health of the general population with a focus on environmentalism. And Bègue de Presse was no lowly practitioner. He was a prominent and influential expert in his field. He served as royal censor and physician of the Paris Medical Faculty. The translator of Lynn's treatise on scurvy was Jacques Savary, a naval physician who was stationed at Brest. Similarly, Thion de la Chaume, who translated Lynn's essay on diseases incidental to Europeans in hot climates, had served as a physician in the French army on stations abroad. Now, the one exception is the translator of Pringle's Observations on the Diseases of the Army, Pierre-Henri Larcher, who is better known for his French translation of Herodotus. He translated Pringle during a period of productive Anglophilia. Apparently, he also translated many of Alexander Pope's writings and went for scurvy. So historians of publishing have likened 18th century translations to piracy, as they point out that few original authors would have known about a translation, let alone have received financial credit or provided approval. Yet this was not the case for military medicine, suggesting that these French and British practitioners worked within a networked community. So in the translator's preface to Pringle's second French edition of Observations on the Diseases of the Army, Larcher notes that he gained access to the original English text directly from Pringle himself. Even more extraordinary, the 71 French edition is based on the 7th English edition of Pringle's work, which was not published in England until 1774. So a French audience gained access to Pringle's revisions 3 years before English readers did. So although these texts were written in order to help win wars, military medical writings were thus enthusiastically shared across the Channel. Also in contrast to the traditional view of 18th century translation, which emphasizes the creative nature of textual transmission, les belles infidèles, translated military medical texts were faithful to the original. So the French translation of one of the key texts from the mid-18th century, James Linn's 400-page essay on the diseases incidental to Europeans in hot climates, is characterized by careful fidelity to the English original. The translator Thion de la Chaume makes no alterations to Linn's text, restraining himself to the occasional footnote that either further explains points made by Linn or reinforces them with examples from his own experience during military campaigns. So this suggests two things, I think. First, the text was a utilitarian work, and therefore accuracy of translation was paramount over a creative transformation into a new format. Second, French medicine was so similar to British medicine that a direct translation could be widely understood. Now, in the content of this practical advice, Linn was optimistic in the ability of Europeans to adapt to hotter and new climates. Throughout this foundational text of colonial medicine, based on observations made during the 7 Years' War, Linn pointed out that it was within the power of officials, whether they be military, medical, or political, to make decisions that would ensure the health of men under their command. Key among these was the location for settlement, so choosing dry, healthy environments that could be found in areas, even such as Guinea, that most considered mortal to Europeans. Linn recommended careful seasoning, which would allow Europeans to maintain their health and adapt to new colonial environments. So as Linn explained in one of his most famous passages, men who thus exchange their native for a distant climate may be considered as affected in a manner somewhat analogous to plants removed into a foreign soil, where the utmost care and attention are required to keep them in health and to inure them to their new situations, since thus transplanted, some change must happen in the constitutions of both. Now, the key French texts on colonial medicine reiterated Linn's view of disease and medicine, particularly that of the leading French naval and colonial physician, Antoine Poissonier-desperierres. So in his Traité des fièvres de l'île de Saint-Domingue, which had 3 editions, first published in 1763, he noted that by following a careful system, man is a flexible animal who can adapt himself to all climates, even explicitly likening the body of man to a kind of plant. Again, reiterating Linn, Poissonier-desperierres explained diseases among Europeans in hot climates by means of putrefaction, hence suggesting the same remedies as the British naval physician, so a firm regime of moderation and self-discipline, as well as vinegars, vegetables, and acidic fruits. And he also liberally referred to British military medical writings in his published works, particularly Linn and Pringle. Now, alongside published texts, there's some fragmentary evidence pointing to the nature of cross-channel exchange, even exchange between British and French admiralty officials. So in the early 1770s, Pierre Poissonnier, who was brother to Antoine Poissonier-desperierres, recommended to the French Minister of the Navy that a suggestion for a naval trial of food with anti-scorbutic, that is anti-scurvy properties, be sent to John Pringle in England for Pringle's informed observations. Poissonier explained that he already knew Pringle, describing him to the French naval officials as an enlightened physician having no partiality, and he could inform me better than anyone else as to the experiments already conducted in England. So Pringle, who at this point was a physician to the British Navy and president of the British Royal Society, was thus a correspondent with Pierre Poissonnier, who was the French inspector for medicine in the Navy and the colonies, and apparently willing to share with the French Navy what the British Admiralty knew from its own research into naval health. Yet these authors were aware that their research and texts were produced in differing national contexts. Thion de la Chaume identified what he called an English genius of observation and profundity that had encouraged it to surpass other nations in its writings on foreign diseases. He was not alone in this view. In the Encyclopédie méthodique on medicine, which was published by the French Royal Society of Medicine in 1790, the entry on military hospitals and medicine cites works by British authors as having established the field. And for naval medicine, again, the authors of the encyclopedia note that English physicians have extensively researched diseases of seamen. Most are written in English, and those who do not know this language are lacking the precious information contained therein," and continued by recommending various French translations which were available at the time. So the French openly recognized that the British were more advanced in naval-related medicine, so I think being a damp and cold island had some benefits. Moreover, French publications after the 7 Years' War, when the Royal Navy had effectively ended French naval power, are explicit about the need to emulate British practices. So in his 1767 treatise on the health of seamen, the naval physician Desperierres used the superior model of the British to spur on French advances. He remarked that the British had not only extended British might and commerce through their navy, but they were also the first to properly investigate the health of seamen. So alongside copious references to texts by British naval medical men, Desperierres also explicitly compared French naval methods with those of the British, advocating that many British practices be emulated. So he advised that the French copy the English example of sobriety and discipline on board ship, and praised the British model of naval medical training, repeatedly noting the impressive achievements of British medical practitioners in the Royal Navy. However, he was eager to point out that this was not because of admiration for the Royal Navy. It was, in his words, as much as a patriot, as a physician, that I've detailed the diverse problems I've found and the methods with which to remedy them. Likewise, reviews of his treatise noted that it was the British who authored the key texts on naval medicine, such as Lynd's treatise on the scurvy. So Desperierres thus wished to do for the French Navy what English physicians had already provided for their own nation. So for these medical experts, the study and dissemination of military medicine was a patriotic act forged within the context of national rivalry, even if the science itself was based on national rivals' accomplishments. So knowledge was thus shared across the channel to be applied within the context of a deep-seated and heated national enmity. So as a conclusion, I'd like to offer some thoughts about points of convergence in these texts. Returning to Lynd's essay on diseases incidental to Europeans in hot climates. In reading through the translation, I was struck by how devoid of national identities and rivalries this text was, even before being translated into French. Lynd relied extensively on material gathered during the 7 Years' War, and the text is replete with examples of troop rates of sickness and health, as well as advice practicable from the experience of campaign. So Lynd often cites the names and stations where such information was recorded to support his method of deductive reasoning. Yet, for a work that derives from the experience of Franco-British War, it appears that Lynd wrote it in a fashion that would make it accessible to all European nations. As the title makes clear, this was a medical text for Europeans, not just for the British. The main groupings of individuals within Lynd's work, which was faithfully translated by Thion de la Chaume, is Europeans as contrasted with natives, and occasionally whites contrasted with blacks and mulattoes. In medical texts of the early 18th century, by contrast, specific medicines for British patients, as opposed to those for the French, for example, were often suggested, and relocation to other European countries was described as dangerous to Britain's health in the same terms that Lynd uses to describe the foreign climates of the East and West Indies. So one's native locality, indeed, was judged fundamental to one's health. So such narrowly national understandings of medicine, as reflected, for example, in a medical treatise entitled The British Physician for the Benefit of All Britons Who Desire Health, published in 1716, could often impede translation. So I think it's noteworthy that military medical observations and theories, which in the early 18th century had distinguished among Europeans between French and British bodies, had by the middle of the 18th century evolved to consider European bodies as similar to one another and differing from populations beyond Europe's shores. Although 18th century medical theories were not inherently racial, they were influenced by contexts that were increasingly defined through imperial and military categories of European and non-European bodies. With the largest number of European bodies yet sent beyond Europe, the physical experience of imperial 18th century war shaped European views and practices, including the definition of what was European and what was not. National identities and national rivalries did not disappear in these colonial contexts. As the French and British military medical writings demonstrate, national differences were noticed and commented upon, even used as a spur to patriotic advances and reforms. However, in the broader context of foreign colonial environments, French and British national identities dissolved into notions of European identity and European bodies. Likewise, texts written to improve the ability of the British armed forces to fight against the French, or the French against the British, were easily translated into a general program of Enlightenment progress for Europeans everywhere, especially in Europe itself. Linden Poissonier-desperierres' focus on healthy settlements, advocating drainage and the thorough passage of air, would subsequently be applied in European urban environments, and their advice about cleanliness and discipline as a means of maintaining health and order on board ships and in the colonies would also re-emerge in civilian settings closer to home, as hygiene and sanitation came to define European identity and civilization. So reframing European Enlightenment medicine to include colonial warfare reveals that scientific innovations and medical experience from the peripheries fed into metropolitan networks of knowledge and shaped public health reforms and practices. Imperial rivalry and warfare, therefore, supported the development of medical expertise in Europe's cosmopolitan centers of learning and science. Thank you.